And then after the citrus, what else did he get
so
into?
as he was doing that, he built an office in Lake Alfred, and as he was doing that, he looked around for other ways to invest. And so he invested in land and bought land along what is now the Interstate 4 corridor between Tampa and Orlando. And he put it together, put pieces of land at a time as he could buy it. And Dad said, some of it was bought $25 for the acre, which is pretty cheap back then.
Yeah.
Even back then, I think. So he amassed a pretty sizable piece of property, and they ran cattle on it. Cattle in Florida is mostly scrub, meaning they eat what they find. We didn't have a feedlot. The cattle grew up to a certain weight and age, and then they were shipped to somewhere to the Midwest where they were then fattened in a feedlot and became beef cattle. But that wasn't. So we did that. He grew oranges, and so my father was very involved in that part of it, and stories of him getting stuck out in that land and having to walk in and get on the phone and call somebody to come and help and things like that. Another one of the investments that my grandfather made was to buy a portion of an egg farm. There was a large facility that was maybe sort of like a franchise. There was one central processing plant where the eggs were going to be washed and packaged and sold, but a lot of investors invested in the actual chicken houses, the land, the buildings, the cages.
Almost like a co-op.
Like it was very much like a co-op, but all in pretty much one big facility, one big acreage, and the parcels were all adjacent to one another. And the owners of the investors in this weren't in any way involved in the management. They were truly investors. And the company that did that processing put the chickens in there. It was called contract. We called it contract farming later, where we built the facility and contracted with them to put the chickens in it. And then when they would then do the caretaking, feeding of the chickens, collecting the eggs, processing and sales, and give us a percentage. And that worked for a while. And then they decided to convert the co-op into a corporation with shares, and they wanted all those people that had invested in those land and the chicken houses to trade that physical asset for shares in the company. And my grandfather declined.
Okay.
And so they said, okay, well, we're not going to put chickens. I don't know what time frame, but okay, well, we're not going to put chickens back in your chicken houses. Chickens, there's about a 2.5 year time span there, and then the chickens are taken out and replaced with younger ones. So at some point, that happened.
Okay.
And fortunately, one of the people that worked in that company was from a whole other story. He was rather disgruntled. I ended up working for him. He was my first boss, Lloyd Jones. But he came to my father and said, if you'd like, I'll be glad to run your egg farm for you. And so they made a deal, and he ran it for a bunch of years.
Yeah.
So that was my first job in the company, was working at the egg farm. A couple of summers. And then I went, after I met you and we got married, we moved down, and I interviewed with Mr. Jones. We were expanding. We expanded the egg farm, I want to say doubled the capacity by having satellite contract farms where we had smaller producers, a number of smaller producers. But ultimately we were expanding and putting in a new machine, a new egg grading machine that was state of the art. And that happened to be the time that I came along. And so we moved back to Polk County and went to work. Went to work at the egg farm.
Yeah, it was always fun to know too that
long story.
that chickens do not take off holidays.
They do not.
They didn't care that I was in labor.
They wanted to be fed 7 days a week, and they were, twice a day. I was only at the egg farm 5 years, before we sold it to the fella who had actually started that co-op in the beginning and said, we're not putting chickens back in there. So we ended up.
That's funny, yeah.
It was funny how that came back around. The things that I learned, the lessons that I learned there in terms of process improvement and systems were just incredibly valuable to me. And they're very universally applicable. And there was a lot of I want to say country invention. I don't know exactly how to define it, but he had a real fascination with building stuff.
Who were we
Mr.
talking?
Jones,
Okay, thank
Lloyd
you.
Jones. He loved to tinker. We had a shop there, and he loved to tinker on stuff. But he was an innovator, and he'd had a lot of years in the egg industry and feeding chickens, and he'd figured out a lot of stuff that didn't work and ways around it. And he'd also, I want to say, because he'd worked other places and seen things that didn't work, saved us from making mistakes that we might have made otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So was it difficult for you coming into, so now you're the third generation and you've got an older boss there who's been, who knows the industry. How did that work out for you? Did you enjoy working for him, or what did you learn let's go with that. What did you learn from that situation?
My goodness. Well, we talk about in our Cooter Consulting Group, we've coined the term generational ceiling. Mm-hmm. And I did not so much experience that with my father, not as impactfully as I did with Mr. Jones. Mm-hmm. Because I was there at the egg farm and I wanted to learn, and I wanted more responsibility. I mean, mm-hmm. I started out doing very, very low end menial. I learned how to work really hard
didn't you knock
it was basically
concrete
like
off
floors. I was besting concrete off of creosote poles. I was doing various things with the chickens that needed doing. Mm-hmm. I won't go into that. The first week I spent bending wires on a wire bending jig, and we did, there was repetitive things that we did seasonally, but it was, it's dirty work. And mm-hmm. and I expected to grow to learn. I wanted to learn every aspect of the business and understand the planning that went into planning for the chickens and planning to have more chickens laying eggs, so we were at our maximum production capacity during the holidays where there's a lot of baking done. Mm-hmm. Like from Halloween through Easter, mm-hmm. right? Because you've got Thanksgiving and you've got Christmas, the major holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter. That's when people are cooking with eggs a lot.
Right.
So we needed to have our maximum capacity then. And chickens have a season that where they're, laying the heaviest, and we had multiple groupings of chickens. We called them flocks, I think, like 25,000 each. Okay, lots of chickens. But there was planning and timing that went into that. And I wanted to learn all that. And, mm-hmm. and I was not included in that. Mm-hmm. At one point, I did have a conversation with Mr. Jones, and he said, well, you'll be ready to do some of this stuff, after you've been here 10, 15 years. Because he'd been in the business 40 years.
Right.
That was a turning point for me,
mm-hmm.
Psychologically, because I thought, no, I'm not going to be here 15 years. That's where I had to have a conversation with my father. And my father, this really gets into we need to do a whole other podcast about when you have an external or a non-family member manager or professional manager in a family business, and the communication that needs to happen. Because ultimately what it amounted to was Lloyd Jones was afraid that I was somehow going to replace him. He felt threatened by my presence. And my father was very clear, you're not there to replace him, you're here to replace me. You're just learning, the business through working through there, and you won't be staying there a long time. And it was like, well, can you tell him that, please? Mm-hmm. Because he's really pushing, holding me back. And again, this is the generational ceiling. I was very young, and I thought, when we're 17, we think we know everything. By the time we're in our 20s, and especially after we've had a baby, we realize we don't know much at all.
Right.
But there's still, there's an energy, there's a desire to grow that someone in their 60s, which is what he was, doesn't have. Right. They're more coasting towards retirement, and they're more playing things a little safe and just, using what they've learned over the years, and they've got a rhythm.
Right.
So.
And then I remember the day that you came home and said, oh, by the way.
Yes. So again, a long story to get to that point, but we had the opportunity to. The egg business was not a profitable business at that time. We were in the middle of what they call the cholesterol controversy, where doctors were telling people to eat one egg a week because eating the cholesterol in the egg was going to kill them. That is false science. It's been completely debunked. But it's still, you still see today, how many, 20, 30 years later, you still see product packaging that says no cholesterol on it, because that's how effective that campaign was. And it was strictly a marketing campaign. That's another rant for another day.
Right.
But so it was not a profitable, very, very, very thin margins. And we unfortunately grew into a size where we weren't big enough to get the economy of scale that we needed to have to weather those difficult times. And it didn't make sense. We really couldn't shrink. We were kind of in a rock and a hard place situation. And we had the opportunity to sell it, and we took it, and I was all for it.